let's welcome Stacy on board. Woo.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2, if my computer recognizes me. It's always good when you start and your computer goes, nope, I'm going to go to sleep now. Come on. So, as I say, welcome back to day 2. It feels awesome to be able to kick off day 2 here. We had a superb day yesterday, and I can't wait to see Alan's slide at the end of today to see just how far this thing goes. So, I want to talk about static web apps today with you. And it started for me about 2.5 years ago when I was in bed. And I saw a tweet on my timeline compass that said, if you're blogging and you're using somebody else's site, doesn't matter how good that site is, I use dev.to and I love it, but you're using your time and your effort to build up that site rather than building up yourself. And it kind of resonated with me. I thought they have a point. So I grabbed my laptop and I brought myself a domain name. Actually, I brought myself 3 domain names because who can ever stop at one? So I got stacyclouds.net, .dev, and .com. And once I had those domain names, I did absolutely nothing with them because buying a domain name and using a domain name are kind of 2 different hobbies. My issue was that I wanted to not just install some blogging software and have my own site. I wanted to use it to play and to learn and to do things. So I was going to write my own blogging site. And that's a bit of an issue because I've got to design it. I've got to store the blog posts, display the blog posts, edit the blog posts, put authentication on there because I only want me to edit my blog posts. And it all started to add up, and there's just not enough hours in the day. I was busy enough, and so it sat doing nothing. And then I started to play with Blazor, and then I started to play with static web apps when they came out, and I started to see possibilities. Maybe I didn't have to build this absolutely amazing application out of the box. Maybe I could just play and get started. So that's what I did. I built myself a Blazor Wasm application that reads my blog posts from dev.to and displays them. I've got Azure Functions on the back end to do that, and slowly build it up as I have 1 or 2 hours. And then the static web apps make that deployment really easy, because you have the static files in the front end, you have Azure Functions on the back end, and you have all this awesome glue in the middle to put it together and make it seem like it's just one coherent application and not a range of Azure resources that you've got to arrange yourself. So I started doing that. My static web app, these Azure Functions, to tell the world who I am. So hi, I'm Stacy Cashmore. I'm Tech Explorer DevOps at Omniplan, based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and we make financial advice software. I've been programming since around the mid-1990s, and for the last 2 years, I'm really honored to be able to call myself a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. Now, enough of me talking. Let's do some coding. Now, what we're going to do today is build that first step of the app that I was talking about. So just getting the blog post from dev.to just so that I can list them on my site. And then we're going to skip forward a few steps, and we're going to take a look at authentication. So the first thing that we need to do is create our application. And for that, we're going to make a Blazor application. So new project, Blazor web app. And we're going to call this client, only because I need to hook it into my GitHub repo. We're not going to call the solution name client. We're going to give it a really boring Blazor Talk demo title. We're going to be doing .NET 6 long-term support. We're not going to wire up authentication yet. We're going to do that manually in a minute. And we're not using an ASP.NET Core hosted app because I want those static files to deploy. I don't want any web server behind it. So now we have our app, we can add our API. So that's going to be an Azure function, of course, and we're going to call that API. You'll see why I'm using these names in just a couple of seconds. And I want an empty one because I want to do as little cleanup of my project as possible, which is going to be the first thing we do, because when you scaffold a new Blazor application, you get lots of cool pages to show you how it works, but I don't want to deploy that. So I'm going to just get rid of some sampled data here. And then we're going to get rid of the pages that we don't want, that counter and fetch data. Get rid of these. And then we're just going to make a couple of changes to the shared, because I don't want the link to the ASP.NET documentation either. And the 2 pages that were just deleted, they kind of have a navigation links to them, and they go nowhere anymore. So this is our base application that we're going to start building. The next step is to add some data to this. So we're going to start with the API. And the first thing we're going to do is make a model to read the data from dev.to. So let's just make a new folder here called models. And we're just going to bring one in called blog post summary. That's what we're going to get back. So new class. Now, I've got a load of snippets to bring over here because you don't want to spend the next 45, 50 minutes watching me do typo after typo. And if you do, don't worry, I've got some command line stuff to do, so you'll see them anyway. But for now, for the big stuff, we're just going to bring in some snippets. Now, this is just a really simple class. It's just my blog post summary, how I want to send it to my client application, with just some JSON property names, because what I get from dev.to is just a little bit slightly different. And then with that model, we're just going to make a new Azure function. This is where the fun stuff happens. We're going to call this blog posts. And we want a HTTP trigger. Don't forget to do that, Stacy. And then here, all I'm doing is on a get route, so get method for blog posts. All we're going to do is make a HTTP client with a couple of interesting things that you need to do to get dev.to to work. If you don't put certain headers in, you don't get data back. They changed that after my site was live, and I suddenly got an email from somebody saying, do you know that you don't have any blog posts on your site anymore? And then all we do is get our articles. The dev.to website has some amazing APIs on it, so you can really get all of your data out of there. So if you call API/articles and then give a username, I'm Stacy_Cash, then you get a list of all the summaries back so that you can display them as you want to. So we're going to deserialize that into the summaries that we want and pass it back to our client. And that is our API finish for now. Then we need to build the front end. So again, I need a model here. And full disclosure, in my actual application, I have a shared project here for between the API and the client for the model. But that takes longer to do than just to quickly repeat some code. So I'm cheating here. And we're going to add a new class here. And this one's going to be blog post summary again. And it's going to look very similar, just without those JSON property names, because I don't need those for the data coming from my API. And then finally, for this step at least, we're going to make a service. And this is what's going to organize our data inside of our Blazor application. So this is not only going to make that call out to the API, it's also going to cache that data so that we're not making that call every time somebody requests this web page. And then we just need some code here. So what this is doing, we are injecting a HTTP client. We get this out of the box with the Blazor application. And we have a public list of blog post summaries. This is what the different components are going to be using to read the blog posts. And then we have one public function, load summaries. And what this is going to do is just say, if I don't have any summaries, I'm going to go out and load them. If I do have summaries, fine, I'll just quit. And yep, this does mean that in the beginning, if you add blog posts or anything, you're going to have to refresh the whole page to get new ones. But for the first pass, it kind of works. It's acceptable. And then we just need to add that to our services in our program. .cs file. And of course, control dot to bring in those using statements. Next up, we actually want to show these on the screen. So I'm going to make a new page, which is going to be a razor component. And I always find that interesting. It's not a razor page. In Blazor, it's always a razor component. There's I say all pages are components, but not all components are pages. And we're going to call that blog posts. So the thing that turns a component into a page is actually this directive at the top. It just sets the URL where the page is going to appear. Then we are injecting our blog post service, and then we just display it on the page. So if the summaries are null, we assume it's loading, so we just display a loading sign. And otherwise, we just go through each of the summaries and put it on the page. And the only thing we have is on initialized async, when the page loads, we go to that service and say, hey, make sure you've got some summaries for me. And really, the final step in this first bit is to make sure our users can reach this page, because I don't want them to have to type in my domain name / blog post in order to reach this page. You want to make it easy for people sometimes. And for that, we just add another nav link that just goes back to our blog post pages. And with that, I have my first pass at my application. So we're going to push this up to Git now. We've added the app. Commit all and push, and then we can see what we need to do inside the browser. Once this goes, come on, Wiffy, you can do this. Thank you. So this is my GitHub repo, which was empty. Now has stuff in it. This is good. This means we can carry on. And inside the portal, I've already got a resource group set up for my static web apps, and we're just going to go through creating one right now before we then see how we can run it locally whilst it's deploying. So let's create a new one. Let's search for static web app. Create that. Make sure the subscription resource group's right. Interestingly, this should always be right because we created it from a resource group, but I noticed in the last year, there's 1 or 2 resources in Azure have a bug in them, and it doesn't matter where you create it from. This is empty, and if you just click go, it creates you a nice resource group, and you've got no idea where your resources are. We'll give it a name, IglooConf. The name of a static web app, I quite like this. It's as opposed to a standard app service, which has to be unique within Azure because that makes up your URL. For a static web app, you can use whatever name you like as long as it's unique inside of your resource group. Azure's going to come up with a URL for us, which makes our naming conventions hopefully somewhat easier in the future. Then we have to pick what plan we want. We're going to start off with free. This gives us a range of functionality, so we get authentication out of the box with role-based access management, with staging environments, using CI/CD that it's going to create for us. If you need a more enterprise solution, so custom authentication, private endpoints, etc., then you can go for the paid version, which is a humongous €10 a month or something like that. They're ridiculously expensive. I come from the Netherlands, so I'm going to base mine in West Europe. And as it says on the screen, this is only for the Azure functions and for your staging environments. The static front end is globally distributed by default, so you get that everywhere. And we just need to set up where our Azure functions are going to run. Then we need to set up the deployment details. We need to do this because it's going to create us a CI/CD flow out of the box. If we use GitHub, and I believe these days, Azure DevOps. You can deploy it from anywhere else, but then you're on your own with your deploy flow. You've got to make it yourself. Mine's all on GitHub, so I'm going to leave it there. So I'm going to pick my repository. And we want to deploy our main branch. Then we have to say what we're going to deploy. Now, static web app is, well, basically, it just serves static files. So as long as you can generate static files, you can use it. But it has presets for most of the popular ones, like Angular, Blazor, Next, Nuxt, React, Svelte, Vue, Gatsby, Hugo, VuePress, or your custom other if you just want to do your own thing. We're going to be doing Blazor today. And here's why I call my application client and API, because it's the defaults and it just makes life just a little bit easier. You can change this to whatever you want. The output location, if you're deploying Blazor, ignore it. It works out of the box, as long as you don't already have that directory in your repo. If you're doing something like Angular or Vue, it's a little bit more complex. You have to figure out where the build process is going to put it on the disk so that you can actually pick it up. But most of the time, it's not too bad. So now we can create this. And static web apps, when you're practicing your demo, are really quick to create. They come up generally in just a few seconds. A few seconds? Yes, thank you. And then we can go there. And here's that URL that I was talking about. So it's just made as a URL, Blackwater OC 554F45F03.1, really memorable. We have a link back to the GitHub repo where we deployed from, and we can even see all of the action runs for this static web app. So if we open this in a new tab, we get your Azure static web app is live and waiting for your content. And that content is going to come from this GitHub action run. It creates a CI/CD flow out of the box for us that will get the repo. It will trigger on a change to main. It will build our front end, our functions, bundle them up, and put them out, which I really love, because if you're just playing with this, then it's just something that you don't have to think about and just happens. But you can also override everything in there, so you can actually make it as, I want to say complicated, but that's not quite the right word. But you can tailor it to your needs as much as you need. Now, this is going to take about 3 minutes to deploy. So whilst we're doing that, I want to show you how to debug it locally, because, of course, in the cloud, in Azure, we have all of this glue putting the front end and the back end together. On my local machine, I don't have that. I don't have the Azure resource running. When these things were first released, when they're in preview, the way that you actually had to debug locally was add several files to your application so that when you're running locally, it did something ever so slightly different to what it was doing in production. These days, we can actually do something different. We can use a Azure Static Web App CLI, which went into GA just last month on the 19th of May. And that will replicate that glue for us using a Node.js server. So the only thing that we need to do inside of our Visual Studio is make sure that everything starts up when we click play. So we're going to want the multiple startup projects. And we want to start both the API and the client. And then when we spin that up, we hope that I've not done anything wrong creating all this stuff. We have our Azure Function Core tools starting up. And we have our application. And if I go to blog posts, I'm going to get that error message, because it doesn't know where to find my API. So if I go to a terminal, I can now run the .NET Cli Start Command. Now, the .NET CLI, it has loads of different functionality. You can sign into Azure. You can deploy your static web apps. You can initialize new repos. We don't have time to cover all of that. That's literally a talk on its own. But what we're going to look at today is just how to quickly use the start function so that we can get going locally. First thing we need to give is a location of our client application. And what the Node.js server is going to do basically is just proxy all of the calls from whatever URL it's going to give us to this location. Next thing that we have to do is tell it where it can find the API. Now, this is really annoying, because up until about 3 weeks ago, this was defaulted to 7071, and you could ignore it. But in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I don't know if it's my machines, but all of my development machines now start Azure functions on random port numbers, so this no longer works out of the box. We have to just do something slightly different. So I need to get my port from here, 7227. And when I said it's going to take everything that we put to the URL that it gives us here, 4280, and send it to that client application, I lied, because it's everything outside of those glue URLs. So the API is going to go to the API, and it has some other stuff that we're going to look at later. So this is running, and if I come back to my browser and go to localhost, there's a typo, 4280. Cool, it dies. Why did it die? What did I do wrong here? I know what I did wrong. I started it on HTTP. No, I did start it on HTTPS. Let's try that one again. Isn't it fun? I have never had this this error before in Open DevTools. I've had different errors. I've never had this one. Sorry? It is. The computer obviously didn't sleep last night either. 7251. 7251. OK, that is really weird. You know what? I'm going to show you a different application. And you're just going to have to believe me that this one works. Where does this one? This one should be OK. Run all. So this one's actually going to compile my website. And we're going to get a different one here. I am going to try and find out what happens to that. I'll put it on Twitter next week if I can figure it out for you, just so you know what's going wrong. And of course, I've got to stop the other static web app first, because you can't have two running at the same time. No, it is stopped. Apparently, I didn't pray to the demo gods enough this morning. There we go. No. OK, we may have to skip the local demos and just have a look at it running in production in a second. Because apparently, this is just really not happy. And I don't know if Windows Update has done something strange or what, but we'll see. Let's try one last time. Let's try it in a different terminal window. No, that's not going to work. Nope, I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to skip the local demos and just look at it working in production. I apologize for that. On the bright side, whilst we've been, looking at that and I've been swearing to my computer a little bit, we have a nice green tick here, so we should at least be able to see it running here. There we go. I now have my blog post from dev.to nicely listed in my app. And if I click on a link, I get it opened in dev.to. And this was literally the first part that I did when I started creating my website. Now, I'm going to skip forward just a little bit. The next step that I did on my personal website was to actually display the full blog post locally. But more interesting is actually editing them locally and storing them locally and not doing anything in dev.to anymore, but just all having it on my own environment. For that, we need authentication. Now, I am not an authentication person. I'm seriously not an authentication person. We have somebody for that in the office, and he's awesome, and I thank him for it. Thankfully, static web apps actually have us covered pretty nicely here. Some of that glue is actually built-in authentication. If we go to .auth/me, then we get a JSON object back client principal, and it's null right now because I'm not logged in. Now, you see me create this code. You've seen what I put in there, and there is nothing to allow me to do this. That will take me to Twitter. It will log me in, ask me for my consent to use my Twitter information. And now when I come back to my site, I am now, hopefully, if Azure does its thing, It's early morning, isn't it? There we go. I'm now logged in. Can't see anything in the site yet because I've not built it. But if I now go back to that .auth/me, I now have a filled client principal. Is that visible at the back, or do you want me to zoom in? Cool. So we have a client principal here, and the first one that we have is the identity provider. How did you log in? Now, I use Twitter, but out of the box, we have Azure Active Directory, Twitter, GitHub, and Google. Then we have the user ID, and I'm not doxing myself here because every static web app that you make, you will get a new user ID. So once I delete this at the end of the session, it's gone forever. My user details, and this is my Twitter handle. And this is also why I use Twitter to log in. If you use Twitter or GitHub, it's your user handle. If you use Azure Active Directory or Google, it's your email address. And then we get the roles that are associated with your account. By default, anybody who logs into your website gets anonymous and authenticated. And we can add new roles to that if we need special functionality for certain people. So let's see how we can use this inside of the application. Let's go back to our Visual Studio. And what we're going to do is add some new functionality to both the client and the server for basic authentication. So first one that we're going to do is create a new object in the client application called Static Web App Authentication State Provider. No, I don't want NuGet packages yet. That comes later. We want a new class, nice long name, and again, full disclosure, this should really be in its own project that we just access, and it should be split up nicely into different files, but time. And in here, we have 3 classes at the bottom. We have an authentication data provider, that is that object that we get back from that auth/me route. We have our client principal, and we have SWA claims, which you didn't just see on the screens there, because these are only available in custom authentication. Then I do need to add some NuGet packages to get rid of these red lines. Let's quickly do that. We need to install Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components Authorization so that we can use it. Don't install the preview yet. Install 6, because otherwise things go boom quite nicely. Say yes to everything, because nobody ever reads this. And hopefully these red lines should disappear in a second now. Hopefully. Thank you. So inside of here, what we're doing is creating an authentication state provider specifically for our Azure Static Web App. And what we do, first thing we need to do is get a client principal, get that object from the website. Because this is a Blazor Wasm application, it runs inside the browser, which means that when we make the call to that auth.me endpoint, we're using all of the authentication cookies that the user has. So we can get this data back, and we can trust what the static web app is giving us. So we make that call, we extract the client principal. If there isn't one there, then we just make a new client principal, assuming the person's not logged in. The next thing we need to do is convert this thing, because a Blazor application doesn't need a client principal, it needs a claims principal in order to work. In order to make that conversion, first thing we do is strip out that anonymous role, because you know what? If somebody's anonymous, I don't actually care. I'm just going to treat them as though I don't know them. Then we see if they've got any roles left over. If they don't, we just return a new empty claims principal. That user is not authenticated in the app. If they do have roles left over, then we make a new claims identity based on the identity provider, based on the name identifier and the name that we get back in that client principal. And then we just add each of the roles that are left over to be passed back as a new claims principal. And that's pretty much it. Once we have this, we can then just make sure that this is available inside of our services again. So again, we're going to go into the program.cs, and we're going to add a new line with, again, control dot, just to bring up that using statement. And we now have authentication built into the application. Now we just need to use it. First one that we need to do, because it's a Blazor application, is make sure that we have a cascading security available to us. So outside of our router, we're going to add a cascading authentication state. Yeah. And this is just going to make sure that in any component that we call inside of our application, we can now get access to the authentication state of that particular user. And we're just going to add another using statement to this underscore imports. I love underscore imports because it keeps your components looking really clean. I know that other people have differing opinions about having global usings, but I adore them. And now, just to show how we can use this, I've got two things that I want to do. The first one is inside of our navigation. I just want to put a login link. So underneath my link to blog posts, I'm going to add an authorized view. And what this is going to do is allow me to see whether or not the user is authenticated or not. If they are authenticated, if they're authorized, and you can also limit this to authorized for certain roles, so you can have multiple authorized here. If you're authorized, then we're just going to give you the logout button. And we're going to check, are you a super user? If you are a super user, we're going to tell you that you're a super user. If you're not, then we're just going to give you a standard user indication. If you're not logged in, then we're just going to redirect to that Twitter login so that you can log in. The second one that I want to do is just inside the main layout, where we used to have the link to the ASP.NET documentation. We're just going to have a little something that says whether or not you're logged in, and if you are logged in, then what authentication type did you use? What provider did you use? Not necessarily useful, but just to give you an idea what you can get out of it. And last but not least, for the client application, I'm going to be adding a static web app config file. Now, this is a really powerful JSON file for Azure Static Web Apps. You can control your routes here. You can control your authentication here. You can control what authorization providers you want to use inside your app. We're going to be really simple today and just adding a few routes. So I want a new item, and we want that to be a JSON item. And static web app config.json. There we go. And I've got a little app here. So what we're doing, I'm going to make two APIs in a second. And one of them is going to be auth test, and the other one's going to be auth test 2, because naming is hard. And I want to make sure that the first one is only accessible to super users. Second one should be accessible to anybody who is authenticated. And the other one, for whatever reason, I don't want people to log into my app using Azure Active Directory. I only want them to use GitHub, Twitter, or Google. So I'm just going to say that special glue URL that you can't actually control directly, we're just going to return a 404 if anybody goes there. Finally, not to do with authentication, but super important, we have a navigation fallback. When you first deploy your application, if you don't have this navigation fallback in there, users are going to be able to click around your site and it's going to look awesome until they hit F5 or they bookmark a page. Because these pages, they don't exist on that server. So they're going to make a request to blog posts and the server's going to go, I don't know what a blog post is. You're going to get a 404 back and you're going to have unhappy users. The navigation fallback, that changes that. It sends everything back to index, so your page still loads, and then Blazor will take care of the routing, and you can get to the page that you want to go to. This doesn't happen out of the box, and until they started using this navigation fallback, you had to do some really interesting tricks using proxies and Azure functions and all sorts of other stuff to make it work for you. I'm really pleased it's easy now. So that's what we need, everything in the client side. And the reason why we're putting the API authentication in the client side is because it goes in this WW route, so that gets deployed when you publish your app, and that controls the static web app. So let's clean up our tabs a bit, and now we can start on our API. First thing we need to do is to get access to our authentication. So we're going to add a new class, and that's going to be called Static Web App Api Authorization, because again, naming. And this works ever so slightly different than on the client side. We still have this client principal in these SWA claims that I was talking about. Only now, we can't call that endpoint anymore because we no longer have all of the cookies that we need for authorization. The way that this is solved is when a request for an API goes through the static web app, this XMS client principal header is injected into it. The user will never see this header. So it's one that we can trust, it can't be played with, and we can extract our data from there to use for the authorization and authentication in the backend. And here, all I'm doing just to show that it's working is just stripping some data out and returning it to the front end. But this is really useful if you want to know who is logged in so that they can only access their data or they can only edit their data. This is where you get that data from. I wouldn't use it for the full-on access control because the static web app API is way simpler and you're less likely to put a bug in there. So now we're going to add a couple of functions, this auth1 and auth2. Sounds like a Dr. Zeus book. So we want HTTP trigger again. We are going to bring across our function. And all we're doing is just, pass in the HTTP header for that client principal that we just looked at, and then just outputting that data back to the front end. And then we're going to do the same again, just with number 2. Functionality here is entirely the same. It's just purely what's in that static web app config file that makes the difference. And we're just going to change the names here so that it doesn't complain at us too much. And that's everything that we need to do for our authentication. So let's add auth. Commit all and sync. Save everything. Always fun when you forget to save stuff and then when it's deployed you go, oops. I'm too used to VS Code that just saves on as you type. So now if we go back to our Azure Functions, we have the second build kicked off because that's our built-in CI/CD that we got with the application itself. And this, again, it's going to take about 3 minutes to deploy. Now, I was going to demo this locally, but obviously that's not going to happen. So what I want to do instead is show you how you can make custom domains for your application. Because as much as static web apps come up with interesting names, I've had yellow beaches, red rivers, black water. It's not exactly catchy to kind of like sell your own brand. So we're going to put something much better on here. I'm not going to do that in the app that I've just made because I have to set up stuff in my DNS to get this to work, and that either works in 10 minutes or 48 hours, and I don't really think you want to wait that long. So I have one that I made earlier. And we're going to be, hey, that's new. Ooh. We can now do custom domains on Azure DNS. That is literally so new that when I ran through this yesterday, this option wasn't there. But we're going to use a different DNS provider. And we're going to go for www.stacyclouds.com. And what it's going to do is say that in order to make this work, you have to put a CNAME record in your DNS so that you prove you own it. I click Add Now. And that should just work nicely. If you don't have one, it's going to give one of 2 errors to you. So it's either going to tell you that the record is wrong. It's linked to a different custom domain or a different application already. Or it's just going to tell you, nope, you don't have any records there. Are you sure that you've added it? This also takes about anywhere between 1 and 10 minutes. So this one's also a nice one to demo because it's like, is it going to be there by the end? We can keep our fingers crossed and hope. How's that deployed in 2 minutes in? Go on then.
My My question is now, you've been using Blazor. What's your take, or do you have any thoughts on the future of it? Do you see it being used in Netherlands or elsewhere? Is it receiving any favor with developers? And if you want to widen to WebAssembly, what kind of thoughts do you have on that?
So the question, if I heard it correctly, and if not, you can correct me, about Blazor and whether or not it's being adopted.
What's the future? Do you see it being used seriously by the industry?
Yeah, I already know several people that use it in order to do production websites, public-facing production websites. They're not using the WebAssembly, they're using the server version. In my company, we use the WebAssembly at the moment for our admin portals because we're trying to gauge it. It's a nice one to use, certainly for the hobby sites. It's really quick, it's awesome. And we wanted to see what we had to do to actually make it work inside of, like you say, a real full-blown application. See whether or not we can use it in the future. The fact that it runs on WebAssembly, I think that's a thing that's really in its favor. It's not Silverlight 2.0, which is a question that you normally get asked, is this just another Silverlight? But it's not. It's running on a standard, and it's built into all the browsers by default. It's not a plugin. The biggest issue that it has is that first page load, because you are downloading the full-on .NET WebAssembly DLLs in order to get started. It depends on how much that first load time matters for your application to see how much of an issue that is. I've solved that on my own website by pre-rendering the pages. So I have a function that just goes through, renders all the pages, uploads that to the repo, and I've literally got HTML pages for each of my Blazor pages. So content might change if I add new blog posts and things, but there is something there already. You don't just sit staring at a load screen for an age. But if you've got an app like our admin app, it's fine. And to be honest, for our customer-facing app, loading all of the Angular stuff and loading the Blazor WebAssembly stuff, Blazor's slower, but it's not the biggest difference in the world. So I think it's going to be OK. Only time will tell. I might be completely wrong here. I might be Rick from 7 years ago. But we'll see. Right? You can get me back for this in a couple of years. So no, it's, yeah, we'll see. But it's quite nice to use. I've got to say, for C# developers, everybody in my office loves it. The Angular developer, not so much. But I think that's the same with any front-end application. It's you've got to make sure that you are using the one that you're comfortable with. I wouldn't tell any Angular developer, stop what you're doing and use Blazor. But I would say, yeah, take a look at what frameworks are out there and use the best one that works for you. You're welcome. Thank you. So now, if we refresh the site, we have this auth provider at the top. I can now log in. I will go back to my application. I'll go back to Twitter, come back to my application, and I am now a standard user. So if I now try and access my APIs, so API/auth test, and I get a 403 forbidden. Now, one of the things that I wanted to show in the local demo is the fact that this is not the same. I get a different error message in production than I get locally. There's a bug in the CLI. It returns a 401 instead of a 403. It just gives unauthorized for everything. And it's important because you need to know that that static web app CLI does not give you the Azure resource locally. It only replicates it. And they even say themselves, this might not match. Always test in an Azure environment before you actually go live. If I go to my auth test 2, yes, I actually get some data back. So you can see that this is from auth test 2. I'm Stacy Cash. I've got my user ID and these 2 roles. So we now have authentication built in, but I'm only a standard user. And I want to get access to that auth test, and I want to see super user just here. So we're going to do that using this role management. Now, this is built in. Out of the box, on the free version, you can set up, I believe it's 25 users with different roles. Doesn't sound a lot, but you only need this for the users with special roles. So for an amount of things, this is going to be good enough for you. If you need more than that, then you can buy the standard tier, you can pay money, and then you get 25 roles on this page. And I don't know why that's not different. But what you do get with the custom authentication if you pay is you can set up your own role provider. It's a separate Azure function. We're going to build one in a second. And when you get that working, then the sky's the limit. You can have as many as you want because you are in control of it. Right now, I'm going to invite somebody from GitHub. Oh, another important one. I stopped Azure Active Directory being used as a login provider for my site. I can still select Azure Active Directory here, send somebody a link, and they're going to get a 404 doesn't exist. So that doesn't talk to each other. So bear that in mind when you're inviting people. But I want GitHub, and I'm Stacy Cashmore on GitHub, and I want to give myself super user rights. And I'm going to generate a link that's going to last for an hour. And if I come here, let's log out first. Now I'm going to go out to GitHub. I still need to give my consent again, because it's the first time I've logged in with GitHub. And I'm now this super user. And that's how easy it is to get people into your site with special functionality. And now if I go to auth test, we get that same information back. It works for me. Woohoo! Small proviso, this is cached. There's a reason why I didn't add the extra role to my Twitter user, and that's because it takes somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes for this to actually get into the system, which is annoying when you're adding a role. What's even more annoying is if you remove a role, it still takes that 5 to 20 minutes before it actually appears on the site. So this isn't perfect. But again, for what it's aimed for in the free tier, for out of the box, it works quite nicely for us. So the next one that we're going to do is add custom authentication so that we can take this from a hobby website and we can use this inside of our corporate environment. So we're going to go back to Visual Studio. And we are going to add custom authentication. And this is a really complex change. The amount of code that you have to do is impressive. Inside of our static web app config, we just have to add a new node to our object. So what this does is set up our custom authentication, and it says, for my roles, I no longer want to go to the Azure portal roles. I want to use this function. And then we add our providers. Now, I'm going to be using Auth0 here because it's just nice and easy to set up on the fly. And we have to figure out an ID and a secret. You don't put the ID and secret into the config file because you really don't want to put those into your code. We're going to set up configuration options for that inside of the app in a couple of seconds. And then we just set the schema, the well-known ID configuration, and push that up to the site. Now, if I wasn't using the custom roles, this is all you have to do. There's no actual code change to use custom authentication itself. It's purely a configuration option. But because I do want to use that custom roles, I'm going to have to add a new API. So we're going to add another new Azure function, call it getRoles, HTTP trigger again. And this one is a little bit more complex than the other ones we've had. Let's get rid of the Solution Explorer so we can see what we're doing. It's on a post. And we have to get the request body so that we can access it. And inside that request body, there is a client principal with all of the basic authentication data that we have, plus a little bit of extra. We'll see that once it's deployed to production. Fingers crossed we get there in time. And we can use that extra information to actually decide what roles our user needs to have. So now that we have this, this is all available on GitHub, by the way, so I'm going to also learn to speak. I'm also going to tweet the location of the GitHub so that you can actually try this yourself. So we need, I closed it, didn't I? I didn't just hide it, I closed it. So we've added custom auth, another typo, but we can live with that. And we're going to push that up, and we're going to do another rebuild. So let's check that that's actually going. Thank you. So while this is building, we're going to see what else we have to do to get this set up. First one that we have to do, and the one that I always forget and end up pulling my hair out about why it's not working, is we need to change our hosting plan. Because for custom auth, we have to use a standard app. We can't use the free tier anymore. But like I say, it's not the most expensive app inside of Azure, so it's quite reasonable to do. Once we've done that, we need to make our Auth0 application. So let's make a new one here. IglooConf. And here we're going to need that client ID and the client secret in a minute. But first of all, we need to set up some information inside of Auth0. We need to do the login URL, the callback URLs, and the logout URLs, which all have to start with this. And then we just have a little bit of information that we need to bring across. So our login is going to be login/auth0. So before it was /Twitter. When you're using custom authentication, it's just whatever you name it inside that static web app. And the callback URLs are just the same thing, but just with callback at the end. For the login and the logout. So save these changes, and then I am going to dox myself. I have my client ID, which I'm going to bring across to my configuration. Come on, Portal, you can do this. And that one needs to be, what was it called? My Auth0 ID. And then I need to add my secret. I am going to delete this secret as soon as I sit down. Yeah, take pictures. So we're going to bring our secret across, and that should be everything set up inside of our static web app. And now we just need to wait for it to be deployed. While it's being deployed, I mentioned before that CLI replicates what happens inside of your Azure static web app. It doesn't create it, and you need to test it inside of Azure. This doesn't mean to say that you need to push it out to production and do a test in production and go, please work. There is a really nice piece of functionality inside of Azure Static Web Apps that when you create a pull request, by default, we get a website made for us. It's a staging environment. It only exists in the same region as your Azure functions, but it's available for you to test in production. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to open this one up, and I'm going to open the original up. So in my original, in my fetch data, I have the very boring, very standard, this component demonstrates fetching data from the server. I thought that was boring. So in my pull request, I've changed that to, oh, the weather outside is frightful because I did this when it was snowing outside. And actually, I'm at IglooConf, so it kind of works today too, even though it's sunny outside. So this is all set up by default. It's a slightly different URL. It means that you can test your application in a proper Azure environment, and you are going to see if things work or don't work as they would in production. Word of warning. If you are on the free tier, you cannot hide this from the world. So if you're operating on the free tier and you have got something that you cannot possibly let the world stumble across, I'm afraid this isn't going to work for you. You're going to have to come up with your own pipeline, deploying to 2 different places or something and make it fun. If you are running on the paid tier, then you can add a password to all of your staging environments to make sure that only people who should access them can access them, which is probably a little bit safer. When you've finished your pull request and you complete it, there's another flow that starts that does all of the cleanup for you. So you're not going to be left with huge amounts of staging environments around the place that you don't know about. It's all sorted for you. And Azure Static Web Apps kind of force you to do this because there's a limit on the staging environments you can have. On the free tier, you can have 2. On the paid tier, you can have 5, I believe. How are we doing with our thing? Our custom auth is working. Right, let's see. Does this actually work? So if I click login now, it doesn't do anything. That's interesting. Why am I going to Twitter? Because I didn't change my login button, of course. That's good. If you had custom auth, well, at least I know the custom auth is working. If you had custom auth, then the standard ones no longer work. You only have access to the custom auth that you set up. So if I go to auth 0, I was already logged in, which is a shame. But I've now gone out to auth 0. I have got my information from auth 0. You can see that the provider's changed up here. And I can now access everything that I need to do as I want to. I'm not going to show you the auth.me page, I'm afraid, because that does now have personal data on it that I really don't want to put on the screen. But if you give this a go yourselves, then you'll be able to see just what you get back. And I think for an out-of-the-box, it's quite impressive how we're doing. I've got 3 minutes left. So the last one that we're going to do, the custom domain. So we now have this yellow border. So it's this application. No, that one is the pull request. So this application now has a second URL available to it, mystacyclouds.com. And in fact, if we go back to the overview, it even changes a URL for the application now to be your custom domain. If we open this up, I have stacy.clouds. I have a nice padlock in the corner because you get your SSL out of the box for your domain. And everything's working as it should do. So that's that. Well, that's not bad. All of the online demos worked. It was just the personal ones it didn't, which is, you know, nicely opposite to what it normally does. So then, we have, inside of around 45, 50 minutes, created our application, got our data from dev.to, displayed it in an OK manner. We can sort out the CSS later. We've looked then at what we can do to do pull requests so that we can actually check our changes before we go to production. We have added a custom domain so that people can find us easily. And we've even looked at what we can do for authentication, both out of the box and that custom authentication so that we can actually use it in an enterprise environment and not just as a little hobby site. This is only the start of how I built my application, my personal site. It's a work in progress. It will be forever, I imagine, because there's always going to be bits that I'm going to be changing as I go along. On the screen right now is a QR code that will take you to, I believe, MS Learn for static web apps. If you've kind of like triggered by what you've seen, then take a look. And if you're not, take a look anyway, because MS Learn is absolutely awesome. And yeah, thank you very much for your time this morning. It has been absolutely amazing to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and enjoy the rest of the day.